words. All right. My name is Todd Trotz, and I'm the founder and president of AI LA Community. Thank you all for coming here. Now, I apologize already. Normally, I just wing it, and I don't use notes, but it's been a long day. I'm doing a lot, but there's a lot of important things to say tonight, so I just wanted to make sure I have it here. So, first off, raise your hands. This is their first time at an AI LA event? Amazing. And who here has been at an event before? All right. I love seeing new faces and old faces. Thank you for joining us. So our events are a brilliant way to learn, engage, and grow our collective knowledge of where AI is going and where it can be part of this technology and impact humanity. Today we're over 22 members strong and growing, so thank you for being here. We're aware that there's a lot of hype, sci-fi, entertainment, fake news out there depicting AI as a negative or sometimes evil light. Will it replace all of our jobs, or will it become a superpower that kills us all? International Data Corporation forecasts that spending on AI and machine learning will grow from $12 billion in 2017 to over $57 billion in 2021. AI will soon be an economic, social force as ubiquitous as the internet is today. We believe that we must spread awareness and education to a more general audience instead of just the technical minded in LA and abroad. We're on a rocket ship right now with a tremendous amount of momentum helping us become the cornerstone of AI education in the greater Los Angeles area. But we aren't stopping there. LA is the entertainment capital of the world, as we all know. So we're diversifying our offering and developing original content to help educate the world. AI, whether you're an engineer or a general practitioner, you need to get caught up in the latest research. We love that we are developing a living, breathing community of not just data scientists, but people with different skills and experience levels who can all talk with one another. We don't need to be siloed off. We strive to clear the air from all the noise and create content that helps everyone understand how AI will impact our everyday lives and how to plan for the future. When we talk about AI, we have to take into consideration other technologies such as spatial computing, blockchain, Internet of Things. So that is why each month we pick a different vertical and discuss how these technologies will impact it. We have ambitious goals that will lead us all the way to 2028 Olympics here in Los Angeles. In order to achieve these goals, we need more resources and a bigger team. We just became a nonprofit here in California after 2 years of running as a general meetup. And we need you to help spread the word about our mission. People ask me why I lead the AI LA community. My background is I went to USC for film school. It's simple. I found my purpose and my passion in life. I care about legacy, not currency, and without the right leadership, a community like AI LA would be driven by greed. It's simple. I have a big vision, and all of this would only be a dream without you. So thank you for believing us and making this real. This evening marks the first of an annual symposium AI LA will host, focusing on AI in society and creating a fair and ethical future. So let's get started. I'd like to first thank Innovate Past Day for their support during the Connect Week. Control Collective for generously providing us their space for this inaugural event. Semio. Ross.
My name is Ross Meany. I'm the founder and CEO of Semio. We're building an operating system, an app ecosystem of developer tools for personal robots that be in your home in the not-too-distant future. We sponsored a decent amount of the alcohol you might be drinking tonight, so have fun. If any of you are a front-end developer or a back-end developer for web, come and talk to me. We're going to be hiring soon, so we'd love to chat. Thanks.
We have law firm Lewis, Roca, Rothenberger, and Christie, who I was a client of, actually. Good job.
I am Sean Lee from Lewis, Roca, Rothenberger, Christie. We're a general practice firm, but we focus on IP in the LA area. So if you have questions about patents, trademarks, copyrights, and how they can affect you as a startup or actually general, let me know.
Everyone trying that. There's Elizabeth.
Hey guys, thanks for coming tonight. We're really proud to support the AI community in LA. I think we actually see the
how to start. That's their word. You'll hear more about how to start on our panel. And then I hope you indulge in some of our healthy treats brought to us by True Food Kitchen and from Wine or Pally Wines. You can find Pally Wines at the Arts District downtown. But thank you all for your generous support. I also couldn't do all of this without an amazing team. Umang, who came all the way out here from Pittsburgh, Ross Mead, August, Jorge, and all of our volunteers and media team. So thank you all. And so that's really it for me. Please take a minute. So I would love for you to look to someone to your right or left, someone you haven't met before, shake the hand and say hello. Introduce yourself, please. I like that. And so, I'd like to hand it off the mic. I'd love to hand off the mic to Ramon before I develop. Give it up for Ramon.
Where I'm working on AI research, particularly thinking about how do we make interpretable machine learning models. We have a lot of machine learning models that perform very, very well. One of them in our lab can predict with 99% accuracy when you're going to die when you walk in the ER. But it can't tell you why. And if it can't tell you why, you can't deploy it. So now the question is, how do we get the why out? And unfortunately, we end up using really complex techniques like influence functions and other gradient-based and perturbation-based techniques to do this. And that's what the researchers will tell you all the time. They get so excited about their work, they get extremely technical very quickly, and we turn them off. And that's the goal that motivated me for wanting to come out here and work with Todd for bringing AI to all of you, and to show you that we have a lot of people who are working in the AI space who can tell you really powerful stories about how AI can be used for good, and how AI can be a sign of caution for each of us. So I want to start with a little story or something you may have seen recently in the news. You'll see a lot of headlines that look like this, right? You see one on the left-hand side that says, Facebook shuts down robots after they invent their own language. So those of you guys don't know what's behind this story, I can explain. There's this canonical task in the CV, computer vision, and NLP, natural language processing. In that world, there's this canonical task where you have two agents talk to each other. And you have them talk about whatever you want to have them talk about, an image, a video, or whatever. You want to have them have a conversation about the content that's being conveyed in that image. Imagine, to make it a little simpler, imagine if you were standing back to back with your significant other, and your significant other had a picture in front of them. And now you had an empty canvas in front of you. And then your job was to paint the picture that your significant other was holding. And all they could do was ask you questions. What kind of questions would you ask? Like, what would you ask them? What kind of question would you ask? You would ask what colors are in the picture. You may ask what is in the picture. Is it two people standing next to each other? Is it a landscape? Is it a portrait image? Right? This is a canonical task that people have, basically saying, can we reconstruct an image when two agents are talking? What Facebook decided to do is, well, we can just give you an unstructured alphabet, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, and say, use that alphabet to talk to each other. Instead of using the language that you and I use, we end up using this unstructured language because honestly it's arbitrary. At the end, all we really care about is the image. So that's actually what happened. And when they were working on this task, if I said ABC 1, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, does that mean anything to you? No, but unfortunately to these two agents it might mean, oh wait, this means that there is a person who is with their child. Well, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? They learned this ungrounded language that meant nothing to you and me. So you see this on the left. This is the public discourse surrounding artificial intelligence. But in actuality, all that happened was it wasn't humanly interpretable, so they basically said this technique is not going to work anymore. We can't do what we call unsupervised learning. we must do something like some semi-supervised technique. The reason I know about this is actually, that was an intern project at Facebook, and the PhD student that was working on that is in our group at Carnegie Mellon. And on the left is the rebuttal paper that they wrote. It won Best Paper Award at EMNLP, which is the European National Language Processing Conference. It won Best Student Paper, and it was entitled, Natural Language Does Not Emerge Naturally in Multi-Agent Dialogue. Literally answering the question and assuaging everything that all of the public was talking about. And the point is, this didn't get the press that it required. So now the thing is, we are here today to bring to you the AI researchers themselves, the folks that are implementing it, the folks that are working on it in the policy settings, the folks that are working on it in the ethics space, right? You need those folks as well. That's exactly what you told me about. And we're here to bring them to you, to have you hear their story, hear where they're coming from, because that's what really matters. Because unfortunately, the corresponding paper was not titled, "We shut down our AI bot." It was titled something a little bit more innocuous, right? So there's this poor public discourse surrounding artificial intelligence, and our goal is to teach you and to better understand how we do research, and to teach you guys a little bit more about what is actually the current state of artificial intelligence. So now, as I was saying earlier, I'm currently working on interpretable models, and one of the things that we come across is how do we build a more transparent model? And what I mean by that is you have a lot of models that are really powerful, but you want to understand why they work, so we want them to be transparent. We also want them to be accountable because we want to understand, well, if this model takes an action, if I'm putting my agency in the model, who's responsible? Who's AI for who's good? And the second point, and the third thing that comes with this entire topic, is called fairness, right? We think about this all the time. How do you develop a fairer algorithm that helps understand the normative constraints that we place on society? How can we clarify that? Unfortunately, if you throw a researcher up here who's not going to throw math equations at the board, they'll just get super technical, super fast. And our goal is to not do that. So without further ado, I want to introduce the first speaker for the evening, someone whose work I absolutely adore. Just a little bit about the way the evening is going to work. We're going to start with the first half of the evening talking about fairness, accountability, and transparency. And then we'll talk about bias, ethics, and morality. Morality is quite neglected in this space, and we really want to give it the light that it deserves because it plays a really big role in our lives. So to start the evening, I want to go through a really amazing case study on how you use fair algorithms in the real world. And particularly, I would like to invite up Phoebe Vallanos. She's currently an associate professor at the University of Southern California. She's also the associate director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence in Society. She graduated with her bachelor's, master's, and PhD from the Imperial College in London. And her work is not only technically phenomenal, but at the same time, it also has really salient impacts to you and me. So without further ado, Phoebe Vallanos.
you have these individuals that come into the system, and as they come in, they are assessed using the next step tool. That's a vulnerability assessment tool that evaluates how likely or not they are to exit homelessness without having research. Right? This information is then added to the homeless management information system database, and subsequently individuals are basically routed towards the appropriate housing resource. The reality is that at that point they join the waiting list and they're waiting until the adequate housing resource that matches their needs for this system becomes available. What's this vulnerability assessment tool look like? It's basically a series of questions, right, that are asked from the homeless individuals, and depending on their answers, they get some scores. At the end, each of these points are basically added together, and this gives them the vulnerability score. The higher their score, the more vulnerable they are considered, and the more supportive the resources they receive. So in particular, if you score very low, you wouldn't receive any type of housing resource, you would just receive some services. If you score a little higher, you get some rapid rehousing resources. These are voucher-based short-term housing resources to help you get back on your feet. And if you score the highest possible, then you get a very long-term, so-called permanent supportive housing solution combined with services. There's some good things about this policy. It's very transparent, right? We can all understand that what it's doing is it's helping the most vulnerable, right? It sounds like a very good thing. Unfortunately, though, it's not really tied to outcomes, right? I have no idea if these people in the middle area, for example, maybe they could manage without a housing resource, right? Or maybe they would really need a very supportive housing resource to be able to exit homelessness, right? On the other hand, maybe some individuals are scoring maybe very high, maybe they could, it would be sufficient to give them something that is less supportive, right? So there's just this issue of, am I really utilizing my resources in a more efficient or strategic way, right? That I can be making better use of these resources. And so what we want to do in this project is leverage some data that was made available to us from the Homeless Management Information System, this database I mentioned. This was data from 16 communities across the US, about 10,000 youths, 3,000 housing resources, and basically what happened when a particular individual was matched to a particular house. Were they able to exit homelessness or not? And so what we propose to do in this work is to design policies that are data-driven and that are driven by these outcomes that we've seen, right? So we want to understand the arrival rates of the different types of individuals, the different types of resources, how well they fit kind of together, and find the data-driven policy that would maximize maybe efficiency in this system. But it became clear to us very rapidly that we can't just have a very black box thing, right? Where whenever housing resources arrive, I come up with the name of an individual, like John, you get the house, right? That's not gonna cut it, because I want to be able to explain why a particular individual got one of these very scarce housing resources and not somebody else, right? So this is not. What we propose to do instead is to devise a scoring program, right? So we could design what we call decision tree-based policies, where effectively for any given individual that arrives, right, I can check out, for example, what is their age? Are they younger than 20? If so, then I can look at their vulnerability score. Is it greater than 4? If so, then I assign some points, right? So effectively, we're putting individuals in buckets, and based on the bucket in which they belong, we're assigning points. So it's very similar to the current policy that's in place in some sense, right? And I would argue that it's interpretable. Except that we are not fixing in advance what the various branches of this tree-like structure looks like, right? Instead, we're going to try to strategically decide in a data-driven way what these values should be. I'd like to argue that the deeper the tree, the less interpretable we're going to be, right? The less well we're going to be able to explain the logic of our policy. And the more the things that I'm kind of branching on, again, the less interpretable my system, right? So in talking with our partners at the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, who are in charge basically of allocating these very scarce housing resources, we understood that there's kind of 3 things that matter in a policy for allocating housing resources. The first one would be efficiency, right? So at the high level, we want to have right? Am I looking to decrease overall homelessness rate, decrease waiting time in this system, just maximizing the number of exits from homelessness, right? There are so many different things that all like of efficiency, fairness, and accountability and interpretability could mean, right? Again, interpretability could be in terms of the depth of the tree or in terms of the questions I need to ask in order to classify individuals and what resources they should be getting, right? So the first thing that comes to mind at this point is, what if we use just a machine learning pattern, right? I could go and take the data that we have and try to predict if I give a particular resource to a particular individual, how likely they are to succeed, and then start allocating the housing resources to the people that are the most likely to succeed. Right? How would that do? So as it turns out, I don't have time to go through the details of the graph, but the short story is that if we use a method, we're indeed going to be able to increase efficiency by up to 17%. In fact, even if we stay with very interpretable machine learning techniques, borderline statistical techniques, we call them. But on the other hand, we would actually increase racial disparities compared to the current policy in place. In fact, if we choose the wrong ML algorithm, we could end up with an increase by 40% of discrimination. And again, mind you, the current policy, if we look at outcomes, exits from homelessness, is not particularly fair. The current study that white individuals are 1.5 times more likely to exit homelessness than black individuals. So what do we propose to do? Well, so we propose to develop this AI system where we're trying to optimize these parameters of the policy, but we're going to integrate the preferences of policymakers. What does it mean? Fairness, accountability, transparency. And we're also going to integrate what we've learned from our historical data. So we're going to integrate what makes a good match, kind of, right? When I match a particular individual to a particular kind of research, what are their chances of success? What if I don't give them any? How likely are they to exit homelessness? This way, we're going to design more personalized including policies to gain fairness and transparency, right? Or interpretability. In order to address this question, what we do is actually we show policymakers different outcomes of different policy and ask them to choose, in their view, which one would be a preferred outcome. So for example, the one on the left, I would call it an efficient outcome, where we're trying to maximize overall efficiency, but it's not particularly fair.
extremely advanced in the operations research and the robots optimization space. So without further ado, I'd like to actually start our first panel for the evening. We'll be talking about fairness, accountability, and transparency. So I'd like to invite up Jeff, Peter, and Phoebe can actually come back up as well. So we'll give them a second to get up here, and we'll get started.
All right, awesome. So I wanted to start by having the three panelists introduce themselves, just give like a 1 or 2 minute spiel on like who you guys are and what you guys are about and how fairness, accountability, and transparency relates to your work.
Yep, I can start. So my name is Peter Fennell. I'm a data scientist at Tala. So Tala is a data science and mobile technology company that delivers instant credit to people in emerging markets. So we focus on providing credit to individuals who don't have traditional access to credit. We kind of classify these individuals as people who don't have credit scores. So worldwide, about 33% of people globally do not have a credit score, and so that's a barrier for them accessing credit for whatever they need, capital for working capital for small businesses and so on. So that's Tala's market, and so we provide this credit and we underwrite credit decisions using alternative data. So we don't use FICO data, we don't use financial data because we don't have access to that information. So we use behavioral data from people's smartphone. So that's a bit about Tala. So AI applied to credit decisioning, and of course transparency is a very big thing for our algorithms in terms of even on a business level performance, that we know how our algorithms work and that they be stable over time. Tala has an ethics policy which says that we can't discriminate based on various factors, including race, religion, age, and so on. So transparency of our models is a very important factor there. And yeah, that's a bit of an introduction about that stuff.
No introduction for you? So my name is Jeff Kellner. I'm the head of business development at Upstart, so I'm not a machine learning data science expert, so I'm going to have to try and keep up tonight with the panel. It's a little more technical. But Upstart is an online lending company, so not quite like Tala. We operate here in the United States. We issue unsecured personal installment loans. The average loan we use is about $12,000. But like Tala, we use both alternative types of data. They're not mobile phone behavioral data, primarily data related to education, income, occupation, to augment the credit files that we get from creditors when we decide to make lending decisions. And we also operate, given that we're here in the U.S., in a highly regulated environment. So an ethics policy, we have an ethics policy. We also have federal regulators who have very strict guidelines on what unfair and unfair lending, or specifically what they call unlawful disparate impact, is in the lending space. And we spend a lot of time actually with those regulators defining in a non-traditional data, non-traditional model world, how do you think about, define, and test for fairness or lack of fairness, or my lawyers maybe say unlawful disparate impact, not fairness, because fairness is a very hard to define concept. But how do you do those things? And the end result of that was the issuance of what's called a no action letter by the federal regulators, stating that they were comfortable with the approaches we were taking in the testing regime we had developed to look for that disparate impact within the outcomes. So just a quick version of us.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So I think all three of you guys have touched on fairness. Phoebe, in your talk, and Peter, you were saying that you are always basically thinking about fairness, and I imagine Tala and Upstart both think about fairness often. But it seems that the fairness can sometimes be a reactive notion, right? It's something that after you have these revealing exposés like ProPublica's piece, or some of these others, the Amazon, the bias in their hiring practices, it seems that we always do it after the fact. So what are some current techniques or some of the scenarios in which you're seeing like proactive approaches to fair machine learning, where you're doing data sifting, or you're basically not using ML algorithms in particular scenarios? So first of all, I wanted to start with a question. Any of you guys can take it, but how are you seeing like proactive approaches to fair machine learning?
Well, they're pointing to me. Okay. We took this right from the beginning, and something said, I think it's just a question of are you focused on it and do you care, and are you going to spend the time to analyze your algorithms? I do think there's a bit of the premise of your question which is unfair, which is to say, I mean, because it is very easy to say, okay, I'm not going to ask a bar, and we don't, what's your race, your gender, your ethnicity, and not use them in a model. And say, okay, we're now being fair. And it turns out that, as Phoebe very well demonstrated, that does not mean the outcomes of your algorithm will be fair in some sense, right? And fortunately or unfortunately for us, the definition of disparate impact for lending in the United States does not care one lick about the information provided by the borrower or what you use in the algorithm. It cares about the outcomes of those lending decisions. And so but I think it's important to realize that no matter how thoughtful you are about the techniques you use or the data points you use, you also have to be thoughtful about the outcomes that you produce, because even if you do a really good job thoughtfully on the first 2 points, you can still end up with a model that is not producing the output that you want. And so the key there is to make sure you're testing that output and then figuring out what to do if you have a problem, like what Amazon saw or what Facebook saw. But I don't think it's necessarily that you're being reactive to that, because until you actually run the algorithms and train it, you don't necessarily know a priori that that's going to be what happens in the model. And so it's something you've just got to be on a constant lookout for all the time.
So, yeah, again, fairness is a very kind of subjective thing, and it just depends on the domain. So, for example, in line with our ethics policy, we could say there's certain protected features that we can't use in a model. And you know, maybe in a naive sense, we would say, okay, let's not include them in a model, but there's more to it. So there's more testing around correlate with these protected features. So for example, certain behaviors may correlate with females versus males, and including that information in the model would bias it. Interesting, I was at a conference on Tuesday, the PyData LA conference. There's a very interesting talk on this about testing for fairness. And I think actually one of the successes of data science is how accessible it is. Okay, anybody can learn pretty basic Python, install sklearn, and you get a data set and you can apply some kind of models, and it's very, very accessible, and you can do it very, very quickly. On the contrary, measures like fairness, if we have some defined protected labels and we want to test how fair our models is, this is something where we have to go to a stats book or read some blogs, we have to code it up ourselves, and them kind of tools aren't really available as it stands. So I think definitely lots of the work has gone into developing very complex algorithms that will take data, that will, you know, find very, very precise patterns in that to predict outcomes. And definitely less so on the less glamorous task of, you know, how do we quantify fairness? How do we quantify if our algorithms are being fair or biased? Definitely less sexy tasks than, you know, wow, my AUC or my accuracy is 99%, you know, my fairness is X. So I think it would be great if there was more incentive to kind of develop tools in this area, which I think would be very useful in many domains.
So thankfully we have a tool developer here. So anything to say?
Sure. Can you hear me? It's okay. Maybe I pressed it. It's working? Okay.
Really close here. Really close here.
So, yeah. What was I going to say? I was going to say that I think one way in which these AI and ML algorithms are used are really to replace some human decision making in some form, right? So I think, yes, it is true that they may introduce bias and we must be aware of that, but I think always we should be looking at what the starting point is, right? And ultimately, in such socially sensitive settings, currently there is someone making a decision, right? And the question is also on what basis are they making a decision? And ultimately with the AI, not so much, oh, are we fair, like, do we have ideal fairness and 100% fairness? It's also, do we do a better job than we were doing before, right? So I think we should be benchmarking against what the current status quo is.
And I think that you brought up something very interesting. Right now we have, though you're replacing some of the tasks that the human was doing, you're basically augmenting them to better perform their tasks. But I think you brought this up a little bit earlier, Peter, that like you can just delete these features from your data set and the correlations will just basically disappear. But then you have things like, okay, well, if I take out race and gender, then zip code may also codify something about your background. right? And then that's also been proven to say, well, you're biased based on zip code. But there's an interesting thing that you brought up, Phoebe, that I kind of want to touch on, which is you have some of these people who you don't use these protected. We have these things called protected features, or protected characteristics. If it was like the Fair Housing Act, that said there are these 7 features that you have to protect and can't use, and we don't use them. And so data scientists, you and I will all of us basically know that you can obviously get out the correlations you need from them without them. You can do that. That's possible. But the point is, are there certain settings that we should reserve for just humans to do? And recently I saw some work that looked at, can we actually create something called protected outcomes? Where a protected outcome is, well, maybe in settings of diagnosing mental health conditions, we shouldn't use AI at all, right? So this idea of, well, we can protect the features all we want, but it might just be that the task itself is unfair, right? So maybe there is some fair heuristic we can use to fairly divide credit, or assign someone the credit score. But there are some other settings where AI just can't be used, right? You're gonna always want to reserve the right to a given professional. So what are your thoughts around this idea of like protected outcomes, right? Mental health inferences, where some companies may want to use to basically do targeted marketing. Because if I know you have depression, I might as well market my pharmaceutical drugs for you, right? Because I know you have that. But the question is, are you as a data scientist, someone who's just gonna download sklearn, download some open source data sets, and look, I think all these guys have.
Maybe there are cases when maybe it's not better used. I'm not sure who has heard of the Compass recidivism story about AI algorithms used for predicting repeat crime rates. So these algorithms were found to be like highly flawed, that basically had higher error rates for Black Americans and white Americans, and so on, and various different things. So they were very flawed. And the question is, do we need AI in a judicial system? There's so many factors to take into account when deciding on a sentence or for somebody, and can we get enough data to actually properly capture all the information that's needed for a decision? So I think in lots of cases it can help, but yeah, as a tool at least.
So the first thing that's been kind of bothering me in relation to these outcomes, I don't know that it's completely related to your question, but so for example in this housing project, and I don't know that it's the best example out there, but we want to achieve, I think, right, and again this is not from LASA, it's my personal impression, we want to achieve fairness in outcomes, I believe, right? And something that's really bothering me is, these are public resources, right? We shouldn't be using protected characteristics, fair enough. But the truth is, if ultimately using these protected characteristics can help me get fair outcomes, should that be acceptable or not, right? And I don't have a good answer for that, but I guess, I don't know, I'd love to hear.
You gonna ask that one? I think I think your point about the recidivism is really interesting in that I think we have to approach all the questions about where AI can be used. I feel like there's a sense right now that if you have a data set and a basic, it's a scikit or whatever, an XGBoost model, it's like, I just throw the data into the model and I get a proper answer. And it's like there's no, and the reality is there's a lot of art in what is being done in data science now and machine learning. And the reality is we also have to be very humble about the limitations of what we can do. And so, for example, one of the things you'll find that can introduce these kind of biases is just your sample set is biased, right? The data that I have reflects biases in the way it was collected, biases in who collected it, biases that exist in the world today that will be learned by my model, not because they're real, but just because they're what we've kind of introduced through human intervention in the past. And so there's lots of ways that AI can go wrong, and I think there is just this really massive misunderstanding of like, once you can make it a machine learning problem, then it's just like solved, and we have the right answer, and that answer is definitively the right one, and it's just not true. Now, I'm sure there are areas where we will choose to say we don't want AI making these decisions, and just like when you talk about fairness, I think a fairness plugin for XGBoost would be great for me. But I do think ultimately it's not that simple because how you want to define fair is non-trivial, right? In lending, so for instance, I have these, we do a quarterly testing process for this with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And is fair the same approval rate across different races and ethnicities? Well, if you use a pure FICO-based model, you see very different approval rates across races and ethnicities. Right? If you look at credit outcomes, you also see different outcomes, different quality of credit, different default rates. So where between the historical inaccuracies and unfairness and the reality of what we might experience from credit performance, do we want to lay that boundary? And I think that's something that AI, that's a question we have to wrestle with as a society, philosophically, as policymakers, to figure out how do we want to address that, because there's no simple answer, and I think a lot of people are struggling with how you deal with it, but we have to start from the understanding that some of these questions can't come from an AI point of view, and the AI will not give you the answer to every question you want, even if you have a very robust data set or what you think a robust data set's about it.
Yeah, I definitely completely agree with what Jeff said there about that aspect of it. I think that, sorry, I'm not losing my train of thought. Yeah, I should have written it down. Okay. Yeah, so I think it's important to realize as well with data science, and maybe like Kaggle sets a false precedent for this, because you do a Kaggle contest, you get a data set, you fit a machine learning model to it, and you test that on a test set. And in reality, the data science process is very, very different to it. And the hardest part of the data science process is the subjective stuff that we have to do. So looking at our data, checking for biases and so on. The simple part is when you get to the final data set that you feed into the model and that makes predictions. And it's also important to realize that a statistical model itself is not biased. Okay, I mean, a statistical model will look at patterns within the data and find them patterns and correlate them with the outcome variables. So biased models are a result of biased data, not some self-thinking algorithm that says, I have something against the 1 class versus the 0 class, so I'm going to rewire in a funky manner. So the hard part about data science is the non-deterministic part. So if we're looking at building a model based on criminal judgment, what kind of biases existed in the data set in the first place? So was there bias in judges' decisions and so on versus certain kind of classes? So a big part or a big realization is that it's not these scary robots or the statistical models that are creating inherent bias. Lots of it's just in the training data itself, and the hard part of the data science job is getting into them nuances, and the easy part is when you have a somehow clean data set, which probably doesn't fully exist, and then just fitting a model using that.
Yeah, I think you guys all hit the nail on the head, and there's this really interesting thing that you said, Jeff, that was really, really, I've been thinking about, right? It's like, you have lots of data, and you want to throw a model at it, and that's really what a lot of people do, and you said this earlier, like, just more data, we'll have a more accurate model. But the interesting thing is, all of this data is actually just a mirror for actual society. Like, let's say you were going to get rid of all of your sampling bias, all of the bias, like, all the sources of bias or you think to be true. You may still learn that, oh, you know what, we've been assigning FICO scores unfairly for the last 3 decades. So at that point, hopefully we'll get to this later in the later panel, like, whose morality and whose ethics do we kind of impose in that problem? But I think another thing that I kind of want to get to is the idea of, like, sure, I understand if a model is fair or not. I also understand I build it interpretably. Maybe I use something like I use a sparsity and use a regularizer, and I'm like, okay, great, I have something that's interpretable, and I think I understand it. But how do you go about, and how do you guys reason about auditing these models, right? You have some of these models that may have not learned something that's humanly intuitive, right? It may have learned something that we didn't intend. In the diagnostic case, it might just be because the distribution of the underlying data, it might say that everybody under 4 years old has a fever, or everybody under 4 years old has cancer, right? Even worse, right? And then we go about starting making decisions based on that. So we want to be able to audit that model, and kind of, again, in the optimization sense, we want to basically look at the feasible set and make it more feasible and align it more with our human intuition. So what are some techniques you guys have seen for auditing these models, and what is your take on actually developing, like, auditable algorithms?
So I guess the most obvious one that comes to mind is this idea of training testing, right? That we take our data set, We split it in a big chunk that we use to train and to learn, and then a testing phase where we evaluate basically the performance of our model on previously unseen data, right? This is the first thing that comes to mind. That said, so for example, what we're trying to do at our center, it goes a little bit beyond that, and it's trying to also check what happens on the field, right? So once you actually implement it, right, and you two probably know a lot more about that even than me, right? It's what happens actually when you put it in action, because it's different to use it on the historical data and different to actually get.
I mean, so we get real feedback pretty quickly, right? Because we're lending money to somebody, and they either do or do not repay said money. And so we learn quickly, or hopefully quickly. There's money at stake. You know, it does represent a challenge and an opportunity to kind of retrain the model. And the other thing to keep in mind is that models can be wrong, my model, right, in two ways. I can lend to somebody who I should not have lent to, or I cannot lend to someone who actually ultimately would have paid me back, right? And one of those actually has a much higher cost than the other. Right? So when you think about, how do I want to think about the kind of misses my algorithm has, every problem has a different set of these, but like, it's a lot better for me to say no to somebody who maybe was a questionable but would have paid me back in some ways than it is to say yes to somebody who, you know, is not. And so you've got this kind of trade-off between how do I think about my misses, and also in our models, for lending at least, as an example, everything's not binary, right? So if I give a 36-month loan and somebody pays me 35 months and then doesn't pay me my last month, you know, I came out okay on that, right? Generally, that's not my ideal outcome, but it's not a zero. And so you've got a lot of, I mean, that introduces challenges into building models because you're trying to predict something much more complicated than yes or no, but it gives you a lot of data points to test on to determine, are we doing a good job? Is the outcome we want achieving? What's that?
On the other hand, if you say no, you don't get any information.
Well, there are some ways around that. Sometimes somebody else says no, and I can figure out if they made a good decision or not. But yeah, I mean, it is true that sometimes if you want to learn, you'll start saying yes to people your model would say no to, just to figure out, because you need training data, right? Like if my team, we've got a minimum FICO score to lend to at Upstart, and it started off, our bank partners like, no, don't go below 620. So, well, we really think the model can go super low. You know, because it's going to be smart, it's going to find not a lot of people, but some. But they don't want to lend. And then, you know, there becomes a question of how far away from where we're at today does the training data represent the behavior, and when have we kind of strayed too far from what we know and we're no longer accurate. And so you're kind of trying to go, well, if we want to learn, we got to go and put something at risk and generate that training data sets. There's real challenges to it, but there's real opportunities when you're in the field and in real world, because you generally get outcomes that say either you were right or you were wrong. But again, if it's a self-driving car, you're right or wrong. You know, the risk-reward benefit is very different, perhaps, on making the right or wrong error of do I stop or not than mine is on do I make a $5,000 loan or not, right? So you've got to, those things get weighed in a very complex way.
I think it's really interesting what you were talking about was basically like what we call like a precision recall trade-off, or like how precise you want to be. And I think Phoebe, you also hit the nail on the head. Just like you got me thinking about the idea of like unknown unknowns, right? You haven't seen something, you don't know what you haven't seen yet, right? So if someone's going to come start using Upstart tomorrow and you just haven't seen that type of person in your data, like how will your model react in that scenario? And that's something that's, again, goes to the idea of FAT, right? Like fairness, accountability, transparency. So at this point, I think we're going to open it up to questions. So if any of you guys have any questions for any of our panelists, I think Todd will come around and hand you guys a mic, and we can take it from there. So does anybody have a question to start? I think we can start.
So you were talking about trying to eliminate silos. I think somebody mentioned that earlier. Maybe it was in the beginning of your presentation. But I have friends in the nonprofit world, and particularly in the focus on criminal justice reform. And they're in conversations, they're based out of Colorado, and they're in conversations with similar organizations here in California, and really starting to talk about policy and how they've passed certain policies, and what's worked for them, what hasn't, and actually sharing of data sets and things like that. So is that something, especially in the area of homelessness, that obviously affects every city across the country for the most part, and some homeless organizations have looked at, for example, the model in Utah that has seen some success in terms of providing housing first and then all of the services that follow. So is that conversations that you get into in terms of how you can kind of share the successes, the failures, what you're learning through this whole process with other like organizations?
So I'm not sure I understand your question. So you're asking basically for the mic? Yes. Can you like?
So there's other homeless. You're working in tangent with the homeless organization here in LA.
Right.
Okay. So they have the Bridge to Home project that's taking place right now.
Right.
Are they thinking like through all this machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these models that you're creating, and the impact that it has on the successes and the outcomes, are they thinking about, okay, how can this be duplicated in other cities across the country?
Right, very great question. Thank you. Now I understand. So I guess our plan is to first pilot it in the LA area on a subset of the housing resources that are somewhat more flexible and that for which they have the ability to allocate them a little bit more freely, I would say. Ultimately, the vast majority of resources are federal resources, and so there are guidelines for allocating them that are federal guidelines, this vulnerability, this idea of prioritizing the most vulnerable, right? I think we're just like, my hope is that this should be the starting point to get the discussion going. For example, one finding that I didn't show in my presentation is that actually even if what you wanted to have is fairness by vulnerability score, so what I mean is that it looks to me like when they are prioritizing based on vulnerability, they're saying, well, what I want to do is help bring everyone, kind of at the same level in terms of the chances that they have of exiting homelessness, right? But it turns out that with this algorithm, we're able to make it more fair by vulnerability score than what the current policy looks like. So although it seems that they are helping the more vulnerable, maybe there are more strategic ways of doing that. And so we're hoping that by showing results of this type, we can help ultimately modify policy like at a higher level, but this is the long-term vision, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, of course. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, for the most part.
Professor Vanos, thank you for your talk. This gets at what you discussed, but also at what all of you are studying in that. I was really interested by the statistic you provided that your final model got a 16% improvement in efficiency, whereas the pure machine learning model had achieved a 17% improvement in efficiency. So you only lost a percentage point while actually improving equity of outcomes across protected classes. And so my question is there a layer of kind of meta-interpretability where you're able to explain how you're able to achieve results so close to optimal while protecting the classes that are supposed to be protected?
That's a great question and a very difficult one. So I guess you're saying, yeah, how is it possible to explain, in some sense, the difference, the good outcomes we have relative to the ML algorithm? My short answer is I don't have a good answer for your question. I'm trying to think if there's a way that I could come up with an answer like by digging in the data. I think what I would do is probably look at what kind of housing resources go to whom. So for sure, what happens in our algorithm is that right now, all the more vulnerable people get the super supportive stuff, the middle people get the half supportive thing, and what happens in our algorithm is that half of the people that are the most vulnerable get the super supportive and half get a rapid rehousing, and same for the ones in the middle, so there's like kind of shuffling. But I wouldn't be able to tell you how it differs from what the ML algorithm would do, to be honest. It's a good question. I look into it. Thanks.
We're going to do 2 more questions. Here's one more.
Hi, so I'm an
engineering student, and in our programming classes, our professors always tell us that our code is only as good as the person writing it, and the same vulnerabilities that you have, weaknesses that you have may transpire into your code. And that not only that, your code is highly personalized to the person that is writing it. So my question is for you, is like, how do we take humans who come into this world with their own biases, and we task them with the objective of writing these decision-making algorithms that reduce bias? How do we accomplish that?
I love that. I get the easy questions. The last one's pretty hard. I think it's a good question. There's no simple answer, right? And it's something I think we're all cognizant of. I think a lot of that, from a coding point of view, comes down to the fact that in none of these organizations, even in academia, do you end up writing code by yourself, right? There's no, great, we used to talk about when I first started, the code monkey that was in the back, right? There's no code monkey that writes all the code, right? It's a team of people that do that, and you end up with debating ideas and debating concepts. And so I think Peter mentioned that, like, when you start having a machine learning discussion, like, it's not, hey, which model should we use? It's like, how do we collect the data, and what data should we get, and how are we worried about biases in our sample set, and how do we augment that set with a different set of data? And that's usually a discussion that the more diverse and the broader set of voices you bring to that discussion, the more you kind of cancel out the weaknesses and biases each of you bring to it, and you come with a more robust product. So I think the same thing is true of coding, right? Like, everybody has code reviews. You don't get to push your code into production until somebody else has reviewed it, and there's a give and take. And that's pretty critical that you don't do all this on your own, because any one individual, whether it's technical engineering or machine learning, is going to make mistakes, introduce biases, have all sorts of things that are introduced. And the more you have a team of people looking at it and working together and kind of debating and discussing and fighting to some extent, but coming to agreement, the more you kind of get a stronger result from that kind of combination, I think.
Yeah, I would say the motto should be your code is only as good as the person who peer reviewed it, and definitely, I came from academia to industry, and peer review is a new thing, but it's a great standard that, you write code and somebody peer reviews it and you learn, and it really gets a standard. And, in practice, as Jeff said, these are team things. When it comes to building algorithms, that's the easy part. Really, where biases are introduced and so on is when you're building features and you're saying, okay, what could be predictive of credit, what could be predictive of fraud, and so on. So I think the key element is diversity in a team. Unfortunately for data science, there's a skew towards males. Our data science we have 8-member team, all of whom are male. So that's a big lacking on our team, and it suffers because of it. So I think diversity is great. Diversity of ideas, experiences, and so on can kind of say, oh hey, this is maybe should be something that's not so cool, or we should think about doing these things too. So I think diversity of ideas just is the best way of doing this. Code will be reviewed and it'll be up to standard, but it's personally I think biases are more from the data, how you transform it and make features and so on, and look for potential bias in the data.
And here's our last question.
First, I want to say thank you for acknowledging that diversity issue. When you talked about, you work in teams and reviewing code, you can't deny that. There's a very big lack of diversity, not just for women, but people of color as well. In AI, unfortunately, I see it firsthand. But also, I wanted to mention, you guys have just focused on the data biases, which is very easy for people to understand that you're collecting a lot of data, mainly from white males, but also the fact that there's a lot of models that can amplify those biases as well. So can anyone kind of address that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think the issue that especially at Tala that we focus more on is the biases that can arise in data. Really, I think a whole different conversation is, are algorithms fair? So if you give an algorithm a data set, does it amplify biases, or does it represent biases? And I would argue that certain biases are amplified by more models where feedback effects come into play. So for example, I think there was some, I could be wrong, I think it was Microsoft, but there was some Twitter bot that existed. And so the bot learned to respond, or learned what to say from the questions it received and how it responded to that. And within 24 hours, it had learned into some racist, abusive bot. So there's something where, you know, the optimization is going down the dark tunnel the wrong way, and there's nothing there to reel it in. But as a mathematician at heart and statistician, you know, I struggle to see how purely statistical models based on data actually amplify inequalities that would exist in it. But I think it's probably a question that's worth having, especially maybe for more deeper algorithms like deep learning, where, you know, data is transformed in many ways which are kind of impossible to interpret. So maybe that's a good question of how, versus something like a tree-based algorithm, which is basically saying, you know, okay, if they send more than 200 messages, or if they do this, blah blah blah, which is more just kind of a pure statistical kind of counting operation. But yeah, so I think it's a very good question. I think probably not fully understood at statistical level. Yeah, and completely happy for you guys.
I would say, you know, one of the things we've done that I think is important, our work with the regulator, what I think the important thing that came out of that was that we had a model that runs on top of the outputs of our model that determines, do we think the outcomes are fair or not by this disparate impact standard, right? So we kind of defined a statistical test of, are we happy with the biases that may be in the output compared to historical biases, and do we think it's meeting the standard? And when you actually can define the standard that way, now I'll tell you, when you start getting into this, you realize that there's like, I didn't know this, there's academic literature fights on how to define fairness, which you know, like we all learn in kindergarten, but apparently it's not that simple. And so, you know, we had to start from first principles of what should fair outcomes kind of look like. But the nice thing of defining them statistically is that every time you revise the model, kind of like a peer review before it goes into production, you can run it against that test. And then you can see, is it better or worse than the last model on this metric of, is it fair or not? How is it performing? Is it getting better or worse? If it's getting worse, maybe we don't put that in production. We go back and ask the question of why. And one of the problems, I mean, I think there was a question of interpretability, right? A lot of these models, it's not easy to tell why, but making sure that you're aware that it's happening and then able to go back and attempt to remove or identify the source is important. And that's where I think this kind of process of, yeah, I want to be really smart that I don't put biased features into my model. That's kind of table stakes, frankly. But then how do I look at the outputs and see, am I producing outcomes that I'm comfortable with? And am I testing that in a rigorous and ongoing way? That's a methodology that gets you to a place that you can be comfortable with what you're doing. Although it could at some point just stop your progress on improving the model if it says I'm introducing things that I'm not comfortable with. But there are ways to kind of structurally, I think, handle that from a process point of view.
And I guess, like, off the top of my head, one way to check if you are introducing bias through your algorithm is to say if the mistakes that are being made, right, are somewhat inclined. So am I making more mistakes, for example, for women than for men, for black individuals than for white? So maybe the outcome are similar, right? But maybe I'm still introducing bias by making more mistakes for some people than for others, right?
I think that was this awesome answer to awesome question. One of the interesting things that one of my greatest mentors told me is that never forget that machine learning is meant to discriminate. The point of machine learning is to discriminate. The point is to say, do I give this person a loan or do I not? Who do we prioritize when we're sending them through the homeless pipeline, right? It's born to discriminate, but we just don't want to, again, amplify what we see in the data or introduce some sort of biases. And the funniest thing is that all of the terms, like, one thing that we look at in statistics is we really care about bias. We really do. Like, there's statistical notions of bias, which, again, also do exist. But one thing that I guess you want to take from that is, like, sure, all of your models, they're born to discriminate, but never forget that all models are useless, and only some of them are, I'm totally blanking. Wrong. All models are wrong, and some are useful. Totally forgot. Yes. Whoa, totally blanked there for a second. Wow. And I recently also heard that you wanted, from an interpretability perspective, all explanations are always going to be deficient, but some of them will help you with this debugging, right? This idea of being able to go in there and understand, are you amplifying those biases? So with that, let's give a round of applause to our panel. So right now we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and then right after that we'll jump right back into the bias, ethics, and morality portion of the event. So stick around, and we'll see you guys soon.
All right, love to present now our next lightning talk on moral ethical preferences for autonomous agents by Brent Venable.
All right, thank you.
Give it up.
So I flew in from New Orleans, so I'm on Central, so it's even later for me. And I haven't got any drinks yet, so I'm looking forward to get okay? All right. And to finishing my talk so I can get some drinks. So what I'm going to talk about today is how I want to give you a taste of how we can use existing models for preferences coming from artificial intelligence to embed ethical requirements and moral preferences. And then we're going to see that the choices that we make in implementing these systems actually can pose some interesting challenges. So preferences are everywhere. They're at the basis of any intelligent behavior, human or machine. And that's why preferences have attracted a lot of attention in the AI research community. And you know, as soon as we put even something very simple into an artificial agent, it becomes immediately complex and involves a huge combinatorial structure. So often we have to reason about preferences over large sets of alternatives. This actually happens also in real life. So I'm glad you already had some food, so you're not just gonna make you hungry, but think you wanna organize a dinner with friends and you want to choose a menu that you can cook together. So I lived in Italy for many, many years, and a decent meal always has a carb dish, pasta or risotto, then a main dish, a dessert, and a drink. Everybody's an excellent chef in Italy, so we could easily come up with 5 options for each. So then we have 625 possible menus. So I doubt that anywhere in the world, not even Italy, people would sit down and rank all the 625 and then maybe vote or aggregate and then pick the menu. The humans don't go about it this way, nor should the machine, okay? But before I tell you how actually preferences are embedded into AIs, let me tell you where they're used, some examples, okay? So typical example are recommender systems, right? They're automated systems that learn your preferences by observing your behavior, what you buy, what you click on, okay? What even mining sometimes text, and then they predict a degree of likability for new options, and then they recommend them, hoping that you will choose them. Or we have virtual assistant, for example, automated virtual assistant that can set the temperature in your house at different times during the day according to the preferences that they have observed from your behavior. Or this was a project I was involved, the Mars rovers, for example, or think any rover in a faraway planet, it's too far to communicate directly to Earth, and it has to replan its schedule following and optimizing the preferences of the research team and given the environment, the observations of the environment, right? Actually, this is happening right now. The new Mars rovers will have their brain with them on Mars, but the Spirit and Opportunity and the last 2 Mars rovers, actually their brain is pretty close. It's at JPL. So the rescheduling of preferences is going on as we speak right there for the Mars rovers that are still up and going. All right, so as in general AI, okay, there are 2 approaches that we can have to preferences. One is symbolic, so we're going to explicitly represent the preferences over options or break them up into preferences of components, okay, of little pieces of options. But I'm going to tell you explicitly what the preferences are. And then we have machine learning approaches where you can kind of develop this black box and train it on some examples. Here's some stuff I like, here's some stuff I don't like. And then this black box, given a new item, will predict a degree of likability in terms of my preferences, okay? And now, what's the trend in AI is to put together symbolic and machine learning hybrids, just like Phoebe described earlier, where she had a machine learning approach combined that resolved, in some sense, the uncertainty combined with a symbolic reasoning engine, okay? So I'm going to show you some examples. I'm going to get a little bit more, not technical, I wouldn't say, but I want you to appreciate issues that can come up from kind of what looks like harmless choices, okay? All right, so let's say you tell your butler robot to cook dinner. Go cook me dinner. Well, the fridge is empty. Well, should I cook the cat? Cat is readily available. So how do we tell the butler robot that this is unacceptable? There are several ways. So the first three types of preferences are acceptability and forbidden, right? And we can do this like in a logic way, right? So we can have a predicate, which is just a variable with two values, true and false. I don't want to insult anyone that knows this stuff, but cook cat X, which is true when X cooks the cat, okay? And then we embed in the knowledge, okay, we put in the rule for the robot, for the butler robot, not cook cat butler robot. So any action that he explores that makes this predicate here true is going to be discarded, is not going to be chosen, okay? This is the first option. And there are gazillions algorithms developed by a very, very strong community, which is called SAT, Satisfiability Community, that can do very fast inference, that is, can very fast, in a very fast way, can tell you which of these variables are true and which are false, okay? So huge algorithmic machinery, but behind this type of representation. Or we can use a constraint-based approach. We're still trying to cook the cat here. We have a variable with two values. The variable is called cook cat, and it has two values, yes or no. And we can put a 0 for the values that are forbidden, and a 1 here for the values that are the ones that we want. Okay, different types of representation. Again, very powerful algorithmic machinery that can tell you which variables and how to assign the variables such that all the constraints have a 1. Okay? So now we know we're not going to eat the cat, so we can move on and talk about preferences. All right? So different ways to encode preferences. There's a qualitative way where I just say, you know, I prefer ice cream is better than cake. So it's just a binary comparison. Phoebe talked about it when the political decision makers were the policy decision makers were looking at the different graphs, like they had to say which ones they prefer. And these are, for example, called conditional preference networks, exploit this type of representation. Then we have the, then we have a quantitative approach where I use quantities, numbers. So I like ice cream 10 and I like cake 5. A little more detail, all right? And these seem innocuous choices, one or the other, right? They practically mean the same thing, but we'll see that they have some type of consequences. So let's look at this scenario. Let's get controversial here. So we have an autonomous artificial emergency paramedic that arrives at the scene of an accident. There are two people involved, an old person and a young person, and it has time only to save one, given their conditions, okay? He can use a high-cost medication that is very effective but has strong side effects, or a low-cost medication which is less effective but with minor side effects. And then it can choose between an invasive or a non-invasive procedure, okay? So how could we represent the preferences of this scenario? What should the paramedic, the autonomous artificial paramedic choose? So here is an example of what we call a conditional preference network. We have 3 variables, patient, medication, and type. And we could say, for example, that the young patient should have priority with respect to the old patient. Maybe we want to give him more years to live. In other option would be to say, no, the old patient should have priority because he has acquired more knowledge. He's of more value to the society. I'm not trying to make a statement. Jiangsu, our philosopher, will chime in and solve the problem here. I'm just the AI person that discusses how do you embed these into artificial intelligence, okay? And then we have another preference here that you can see, for example, you want to use the more effective but more dangerous medication on the young person because maybe he can tolerate it better, and vice versa. For the old, then you prefer non-invasive with respect to invasive. So this here is a compact way. Compact, I mean a way that occupies less memory in storage of the computer to represent this big ordering here that orders all possible, you see, solution. Say the young person with the expensive medicine and a non-invasive procedure, or the young person with the expensive medicine and an invasive procedure. So this is much larger, and we don't want to use all the space to represent this. Usually there's not going to be enough space, okay? We can do the same thing using numbers, see? Young 1, old 08, young and expensive 1, old and expensive 05. Okay, so we have constraints, and I'm telling you how much I prefer giving the young person the expensive and possibly dangerous medication with respect to giving it, for example, to the old person, with quantities, with numbers. And here is the ordering that we obtain if we say that the preference of a complete assignment is the worst, the minimum preference it gets across all of them. Look here, old, inexpensive, and non-invasive gets a 08 here, it gets a 1 here, and it gets a 1 here. So the minimum is 08, right? So the preference is 08. So apart from the technical details, do you see how a slight change in the representation changes dramatically the ordering? Here, all the invasive procedure options are all at the bottom. They will never be chosen. They do have the same optimal. But if this doesn't become available, the 2 second best here are not the same. Okay, so a harmless change in the type of representation, when we talk about moral decision or ethical decision making, can, I would say, reverse the ordering completely, but alter the order. Also here, everything is ordered. We have numbers, so everything is comparable. Here, there are certain things that are incomparable, and so some philosophical theory requiring comparability, or sometimes we want to maintain incomparability, but when we have to turn it into action, then incomparability may be a problem or something that we don't want. Okay, so here's the slide where I'm going to fly by, where I talk about morality and ethics theory, and hopefully we can talk more about it later. So there are different theories, right, from philosophy of ethics that all kind of try to rank actions in terms of how good they are from a moral or ethics perspective given a context, okay? So given a context, we want to produce a ranking or an ordering or a partial ordering, just like I showed you, over the possible actions that the agent can take. So the idea is to take these theories and use the formalism that I have described before to represent them, right? So the ontologism, where actions can be obligatory, you have to do them, forbidden or permissible, we can use the constraints. Remember, cook the cat X. We can use that constraint to say it is morally unacceptable, so it's forbidden to cook the cat. Okay, so logic-based or hard-constrained problems can be sufficient to represent the ontologism. For consequentialism, actions are more or less ranked in terms of the harms and benefits that they generate, right? So we can do simulations of the outcomes and then use a qualitative or a quantitative ranking system to evaluate these consequences, right? Utilitarianism, you basically want to add up the rewards or the happiness overall, and then again you can use these soft constraints and maximize the rewards. Interestingly, recently, multi-agent techniques have been used to put all of these in one single agent and then use aggregation techniques, right, that aggregate the rankings produced by these different theories, right, into aggregated choice for the better option. This is called normative uncertainty. It's a work by McCaskill primarily, and it's very interesting that we can embed, and probably reflects what happens with humans, right? Maybe humans are not either, oh, you are a 100% consequentialist, or you are 100% content. Maybe there are different contexts may trigger the use of different theories, okay? So I just want to go through a couple of the issues really fast that one has to take into account, okay? So imagine, think of all the ethical decisions that a self-driving car, right, can be asked, or an autonomous decision system that supports doctors in the ER. It's a huge number. So there is need for compactness because we cannot model all possible scenarios, right? I don't know if you heard, maybe it's not the most ethical example, but this new system, Librados, that was designed at CMU to play poker, okay? It's an autonomous agent that plays poker, beats all the top players in the world, and made, I think, 2.5 million in a round in a casino, all right? So I said, it's not appropriate for this talk, but it's okay. So if you think of all the states of the poker game, they're more than all the atoms in the universe, okay? So a huge number. So there's no way we could fit that problem into it. Similarly, if you think of all the scenarios that a car may come across, is just too much. So we need compactness. Then think about this ER system here, this autonomous agent which supports doctors in the ER, and it has to decide or compare two treatments for a patient. It has to answer fast. The comparison has to happen fast. And if you look at the two formalism that I described earlier, if you use numbers, you can compare very fast. The answer is given immediately. If you just use qualitative ordering, then it may take very long, okay? So there's this trade-off of quality of the answer. Which one is best? How much computation do I use to give you a good answer, right? And if you take too much time, it may become an ethical issue because you end up giving no answer, which is worse than giving a good enough answer. So this trade-off, which is common in computer science or in artificial intelligence, becomes even more important when you're talking about artificial agents. Let's go back to our previous panel and talk about the loans, right? So we touched about the argument of the topic of interpretability or explainability. So if you get turned down by an algorithm when you ask for a loan, you should have the right to say why. What criteria did I not meet? Okay? So if we are using those symbolic approaches that I showed you, either the constraints or the logics or the qualitative preferences, I can go back in the network and say, you violated here, here, or this propagated here, and I can come up with a pretty reasonable, understandable explanation. On the other hand, pure machine learning, non-statistical, are really, really difficult animals to provide or to extract explanations from, right? And often, what you do, you have to go back to the data. I was just trained on bad data, that's why I gave this explanation. Okay, again, so the choice of the model affects the ease of explainability. Then one question that Phoebe addressed is, where do these preferences come from? Where does the 0801 and all those preferences, where do they come from, right? Are we just going to different cultures, different populations, different areas, different continents may have completely different moral requirements, right? So we have to have a model that is flexible and that where preferences, different preferences can be infused and preferences can be changed. So basically there are three ways in which you can put preferences in these models. One is top-down, like I did. I put 08, 01, the programmer puts them together with his bias, like everybody was saying, right? Or you can elicit them, sort of like Phoebe did. But there you have to be careful. So she found a way to ask smart questions to minimize the number of the questions to the policy decision makers, right? So that she wouldn't bug them too much. And they were cooperating with her. But in general, if the robot sits by me and says, so can I cook the cat? No. Can I cook the fish? No. Can I cook the tomato? Yes. Can I cook the potato? Yes. You prefer tomato or potato? Potato. I mean, it gets old really quick, right? Okay. Or the robot could observe me for, say, a month and see what I eat, what I prefer, what I choose, okay? And use these machine learning techniques to populate these preference models, okay? these structures, so once we have embedded the preferences, one can use them also, and here we have to kind of go on uncertain terrain, to say how moral is the structure. So if you have an agent that is equipped with a preference model representing ethical and moral requirements, you can kind of compare it to the ideal one, right? And this was an idea that Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize, proposed, right? And say, how far are you from being the perfect moral agent, okay? Or you can use it for two different agents being designed for two different purposes and say, how far are they in terms of the ethical decisions? So, concluding, okay, a lot of this embedding of the ethics and moral preferences is about ranking actions. And that's why we think that these AI models for preferences that were originally used, say, for the Mars rover, okay, can be used, okay? But we have to be careful. We really have to be careful. So there are two questions that the community is facing. One is which ethics? And probably the answer is not going to be one, right? Maybe it's going to be a combination, and we can discuss more, right? But even once we've decided this is the way we want to go, we want to be Kantians or deontologists, right? We have to be careful what models we use to embed these in the artificial agents, because the choice of the model and the algorithm itself can generate, I wouldn't say unpredictable, but unwanted results. For example, in terms of comparison or performance and so on. All right, I think that concludes my talk. I don't see the chair, but I'm happy to take questions if you have any. It's late, yes. Right. Right. Yes. Yes. So my colleagues at MIT, the moral machines example, right? So this is a project where they showed they basically put online some examples of scenarios that self-driving car could be faced, and they had to decide whether, you know, to hit 3 men or 5 children, or 3 cats and 1 pregnant lady, and so on and so forth, and with really different, interesting results. And right now they are trying to embed them in a formalism, in a quantitative formalism. So definitely, but there, you know, the question most people have is, can ethics be crowdsourced, right? Especially through a website where you really have no idea if somebody's just trying to be funny, like when they train Kai, the bot, to be, you know, racist and so on. So that's the underlying question. But yes, we are working with them and we're taking a multi-agent approach actually to it. Okay, yeah? Continue? Don't stop.
Okay, one more question?
Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, I have a question. Basically, for the quantitative version,
yeah.
AI is quantitating different decisions. It's working on a model of ethics, but I was wondering, like, I think ethics is like a fluid thing, you know, it's always changing depending on your culture and everything. So it must have to be changing every now and then, you know, so it updates itself.
Correct. So we would have, that's why, you know, we would have this hybrid system, for example, where, for example, the preferences could be, the numbers that you saw could be the output of machine learning algorithms that are observing, for example, the changes. So they are dynamic, I agree. Now, the bad news is that a lot of the algorithms were not developed for a dynamic environment, so you have to recompute from scratch, right? And you can't reuse answers you had from the old structure, even if you know what you have changed, and update them, or you can do it but not with a very high quality, and that impacts speed. But I agree with you that being dynamic and being flexible is a requirement, especially for moral preferences. Okay?
All right, give it up for Brent, please. And then I'd love to invite up our next panel, where we're going to be focusing on bias, ethics, morality, and safety. And I apologize, Brent is actually now a full-time professor. So give it up for that. Big accomplishment. So I'd love to invite up, obviously, Brent, Wen, Michael Howells, and then John Sue Kanka. John. All right, everybody. So I think we're going to start off, obviously, as a 1 minute, just give us a brief bio of yourself, what you're passionate about, and why you're here, maybe.
I'm John Sujanja. I started and I'm running the AI Ethics Lab in Boston and in Istanbul. I'm Turkish, so that's the background of the Istanbul Black. I'm a philosopher. I do moral and political philosophy, and I work on the questions of ethics of AI and ethics of technology. And the lab is running projects that bring together computer scientists, engineers, designers, legal scholars, and philosophers to work on these questions. That's all.
Hi everyone, my name is Michael Howells. I'm the British Consul General for the southwestern US. So I am a diplomat and I'm a specialist in foreign policy. And I'm not in a foreign policy job. So over here I do pretty much represent everything the UK is interested in and involved with in this part of the great country of America. And as you'd expect, being based in LA, a lot of that is focused on innovation and tech and all of the many transformational changes in our world. I am a political scientist and anthropologist by training, so I have a certain number of sort of personal interests in ensuring that these technologies are used for the greater good and a higher purpose wherever possible. So that's kind of the angle I bring to this. Thanks.
All right, so you already heard from me, but so I'm a professor of computer science at Tulane University. I'm also a research scientist in this cool AI lab, which is called the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. My research is in what you saw in compact preference representation, both from a single agent and a multi-agent perspective. And recently I've become interested in seeing how we can use these formalism to make these artificial agents more ethical.
Thanks, Todd, for having me. I'm Wen Dombrowski. I'm a physician and a technologist. I've actually been doing applied ethics since the 1990s, more on the intersection of bioethics and what is the impact of technology in the applied healthcare, biosciences, and greater societal good. And in terms of my day job, what I do is I have a company called Catalyze, where we do AI and innovation consulting for corporates. We're also a virtual accelerator for startup companies, especially for emerging technology startups. And we support investors on their due diligence and industry trends. In addition to that, I've previously been Chief Information Officer and Chief Medical Information Officer in large healthcare organizations, overseeing their data analytics, predictive analytics, and the applied use of data, as well as being on their ethics committees and looking at what is the impact of new technologies on decision making. Thanks.
Beautiful. So, there's one thing I think that we haven't really super touched on during this whole event, and it's around like incentives, right? We're all incentivized in our own individual ways. We also all have our own individual biases. So to say that, this is bias and that's not bias or whatnot, no matter what, the teams that actually are building these products, these machine learning products, whatnot, they have to basically have a consensus that what is right or wrong, or what we were saying is the harms and benefits, right? So and no matter what, every individual team will always have their own biases that maybe in their own mind, in their own, ethos is right to them, but completely can, be unsatisfactory to other people and completely, harm others without them really understanding the actual applicable effects. So there's certain companies like the Googles of the world that now have their principles, and people are trying to start developing their ethical boards. But is there really economic incentives for these, publicly traded companies, what have yous, to actually want to do good in the world and actually be ethically sound and serve the most, right? Like as you said, right? Where was it? I have so many notes. Anyways, basically, right? Serving the most and making the most the happiest, right? So, in your own opinions, I love this go down the line, not really center this on any single person, but like, do ethical boards work? How would you form an ethical board? And these are crazy questions, I know. But on top of that, like, how would you even, if you were to advise another corporate company, or even a new company starting out today, how would you even start trying to frame these type of design concepts of how to build those teams, and then thoughtfully think about how you're going to achieve the right outcomes that benefits the most? And you are starting, sorry.
Fine. Well, okay, so it's a bit funny that I am starting to answer this question, because I'm not, being an ethicist, I'm not a huge fan of ethics boards. Because I think the ethics boards are giving the impression that ethics is something that you get as a stamp, and you think about it in the beginning and maybe in the end of your project, but it is not something that evolves with the project and that's integrated into the project. So we are used to the ethics compliance officers. When and I've been working on this, like the bioethics system, where you have the IRBs in academia. But the problem with those is that, like, again, we've seen this in the biomedical ethics already. In biomedical ethics is where we had the applied ethics for the longest time in the best structure. The best structure is in, like, it's the most comprehensive structure. And what happened is that the ethics boards are, they don't actually, there's not even a requirement of having any prior knowledge of ethics to have an ethics board, to be in the ethics board. So it's a weird structure. So I would say it shouldn't rely on an ethics board. The whole idea of integrating ethics into technology should be considered more like a design question. It should be the ethical, trying to make the product or the system ethical, and trying to have the system serve and result in the best outcome should be more like an ongoing, from the beginning until the end, an ongoing design process that's integrated. And again, this brings the question of, well, then should there be a chief ethics officer? And should that one person decide all the hard questions? No, because you don't have a single designer or a single lawyer deciding in your companies just like that. It should not be a single person. It should be people integrated into the whole company. So with that, let me give it to other people.
So that's a big question, Todd. Yeah, almost as big as the bowl of hummus over there. Largest bowl of hummus I've ever seen, but it was very good. So to a certain extent, I think these questions are not new, right? There's always been a perennial question about what incentives corporate entities feel and operate according to. And the whole point in a capitalist system, at any rate, is that these companies should be held to account to some degree by consumers through their purchasing power and how they spend their money, and also through regulation by governments to make sure that companies don't abuse their market position or their whatever power or access they might have. And so, in many ways, this is not a new question. It fits within these new tools. Scale up some of those risks in many ways. They take us into new places, but the sort of perennial questions are the same. Where I think there is a big gap, I think, between understanding that the average consumer, the average citizen has about what these tools can and can't be used for. When they are fallible, how fallible they are, and what their applications might be, what the outcomes of that might be. So I think there's a definite need to sort of increase the education level of the citizenry on maths to understand what these things can and can't do. But I think absolutely yes, there needs to be some sort of ethical oversight to the way these industries develop. We've been living in a bit of a wild west of data for the last few years. I think the Cambridge Analytica scandal suddenly made everyone realise how much we had been giving away, and without any real sense of how it was being used and how powerful the tools now were to use this thing, this commodity that we've been giving away in return for certain services that we were getting. So we need to have those frameworks in place. We're trying very hard in the UK to do that in a way that is sensitive to the public good, but also enables all the innovation and creativity that you want these new tools to do. And we think at the end of the day, what really needs to be built is trust, because you're not going to succeed, you're not going to have public backing for some of these new technologies if the public doesn't have trust in them, and the public needs to understand what these things do, and they need to understand that they are being regulated and overseen by people who understand it.
Yes, you were talking about incentives, right? Well, I think one incentive that all the actors in this arena, is that when you do unethical things, usually it comes out. Okay, think of Cambridge Analytica, right? It was the end, and maybe they had done many other totally respectable projects, right? But that was the end. So it pays off because, rightfully so, the society is very sensitive to unethical behavior, and when it's uncovered by the media, for example, it can have a tremendous impact on the business. So that's kind of an incentive that they should have. Now, this discussion is going on in the AI and ethics community. So for example, I don't know how many of you have read the book Moral Machines that Wendell Wallach wrote. It's one of the first books that talks about how to build moral machines. And right now he's involved in this BGI for AI, which is Building Governance for AI project, where he advocates kind of intermediate committees or institutions that are between the stakeholders, right, and let's say the federal, national government, and they're kind of meant, these smaller units are kind of meant to act as brokers between the interests of industry, academia, and civil society. So maybe there is a kind of an intermediate level. Of course, I think there should be some also top-down regulation, like standards, defined standards, and maybe one option could be to follow, or maybe even do even better than what happened to the bioethics, in the case of bioethics and those types of committees. So I'll pass it to you.
Great, thanks. So Todd, you had asked about ethics boards, and on that topic I would agree with John Sue about you can't just have a stamp of approval from a small minority in a company. So my company, we do a lot with corporate innovation and corporate strategy, and we see over and over again that anything that's really just relegated to a small committee will never really diffuse into the whole organization. And you really need to create a whole culture of transparency, ethics, fairness, trust, whatever the values you're trying to promote, that really needs to be driven down from the CEO's messaging down to the front end people. Because at the end of the day, it's really the junior developer who's working overtime off hours and not necessarily the CTO or the chief ethics officer or the chief privacy officer who's going to be doing all the day-to-day calling of the shots. So I would really encourage all of the companies that you're in touch with to really think about creating a culture of ethics in product development and sales, marketing, whatever type of industry you're in, whether it's for AI or even for non-AI. And then regarding the question about that tension about AI and corporate profits and economics, so I think that we've seen lots of examples of Google's and Facebook and Cambridge where they're using profits as the motive to create unfair or biased AI. And at the same time, Umang mentioned earlier that while there's all these rogue cases or these bad press cases, there's also a lot of cases where you can create AI that creates more fairness, that creates less bias, and so with that in mind, I think what's been shown is that if you have an AI product development team that's taking ethical principles and designing the AI algorithm and designing both the back-end algorithm and the front-end user preferences and the user interactions that interact with the back-end. That creates a product that's actually more desirable for the consumer. So conceptually, having ethical design can lead to a better product that is more desirable for more consumers. And then secondly, this is more of an analogy where, it's been very trendy lately to say, oh, my coffee or my clothes was ethically sourced from, supply chain and workers, that was not slave workers, and, that it was organic and all this kind of stuff. And I would say it's maybe not the majority of the society, but there is a subset of society that's willing to pay more for better quality products that they believe are fair. And this is not just on the direct-to-consumer level, but also people who are investing in mutual funds and portfolios. They're actually preferring companies that are really valuing ethics. But tying back to what Johnson mentioned earlier, there's a lot of companies that are saying they're ethical just as a PR stamp, it's what I call PR bullshit. And so I think it behooves the consumers and investors to really do due diligence to find out who's actually, what's really organic or what's really ethical. So.
Brent, earlier you were talking about, we just discussed obviously the whole thing about ethical boards, and then you brought up a concept about, crowdsourcing these ethics, right? And actually really opening it to more of the public to really determine each individual company about what should be the ethical standpoint, right? How do they line up to their consumers and to the broader world? How do you really even see a system like that being worked with when any type of crowdsourced system already has its own type of issues with bad actors, right? Where they can manipulate the systems, especially when you're crowdsourced, where maybe you're not validating things, and then obviously someone in the room right now will probably say, well, use blockchain, and blockchain has identity, and then that's how you'll be able to fix this problem. But either way, regardless of the technology in place, if you're going to have a crowdsourced system to be able to allow every company to be able to have an ethics board that really is determined by their consumers, so that you are always building a product that is the voice of the consumer, how would you go about a way to really even develop such a system so it is a fair and balanced way of determining what's right, wrong, or what's the best for the most? Starting with you.
Start with me. Okay. Yeah. So I was talking about the moral machine example where they were trying to crowdsource the preferences that should be given in collisions when self-driving cars have to decide basically who to hit, right? And so I think that experiment was designed to gather data that was not going to be used as the basis for designing moral machines, right? But just to see what type of questions and what type of response. I think if we want to crowdsource, then you're right, exactly like you said, we have to address all the other problems of crowdsourcing and really run it more like we would be running behavioral experiment, if you want, with paying much more attention to how we ask the questions. And then there is also a lot of work in incentivizing truth-telling. So you can compensate or you can incentivize people to tell you the truth or to participate in different ways. And I think that would make the data that you get that way much more value, much more accurate. Now, you can always have the crazy person that doesn't collaborate and you. So the one thing that AIs really can't control are humans, right? Or algorithms. It's always the bounded rationality component that you can't fix. But I think that if it is a possibility, especially for a company that knows who their customers are and has a relationship with the customers, and the customers are incentivized to see that the product could become better or more ethical. So who wants to? Yeah.
So I've had a lot of experience with crowdsourcing in the context of both social media as well as disaster response and also innovation challenges. And I think when we're talking about crowdsourcing, we need to differentiate between like completely publicly wide crowdsourcing versus crowdsourcing from a subset, from a specific pool. It's like your employees or your Facebook moms group or some sort of subset. And then the other thing to think about is who is not represented in that subset, like who is underrepresented that you do want their voice, and are there ways to reach them? Because crowdsourcing, well, it's great that it theoretically democratizes inputs. It also, it limits the people who don't have digital access, who either don't have phones or don't have internet access or don't have the time because they're working 2 jobs in a day. Now that being said, I personally am a bit hesitant. I think crowdsourcing is great as a way to survey people, kind of feel out the landscape and get ideas out there, but I'm hesitant to rely solely on crowdsourcing as the end-all be-all judge of various decisions. And partly because oftentimes it's the trolls that are going to be very vocal about their crazy idea or their negative view or their sinister plan, and they're not even trying to game the system. They're just being themselves and they're saying, this is my preference and my vote, and I think we should destroy all the people in here right now who don't have X, Y, and Z. I mean, they're just people out there who have a lot of time on their hands, and they're representing themselves. And then, like Todd had mentioned, there are people who are actually trying to game the system, whether it's the Russians trying to hack the vote and whatever. There are bots and organizations out there that are trying to massively overflow the number of entries in a crowdsourced system to make it look like the results are not what they actually are.
That cheeky thing of slightly redefining your question before I answer it. So again, particularly take a sort of industrialized democratic Western state. Most of the institutions in our countries are to some sense reliant on crowds, right? Whether that's the way our democratic system works through elections, whether that's the way we kind of collaborate en masse in various social endeavours, or whether that's in particular the way in which we participate in economic activity. It's all based on scale to some degree. I think the way I would reframe the question slightly is there something about this industry that demands a slightly different system of accountability because of something unique about this industry? And I would personally feel the answer to that is yes. I think but I don't feel like we necessarily hit on the right crowdsourcing model to make it work. There does obviously have to be something in there about the link between people's opinions and their consent for their data to be used. So I totally take the point about all the shortcomings in existing crowdsourcing models that we've got for ratings on TripAdvisor or whatever it might be, and the susceptibility of these things to abuse. But you can see how if we had a different kind of relationship between users of social media and the way in which their data was then used and the consent process for that, people have an incentive, a different kind of incentive. Their identity is also known, and maybe they can see the outcomes in terms of the services that they deliver, so they have an incentive in that sense as well. So I think there's definitely, in heavily data-reliant industries where people are the sources of that data, I feel like there's a lot of scope for kind of innovation in the accountability in that place to make it more democratic. But I haven't yet seen any great examples of it.
I'll add quickly. I know we are running out of time. So there are two main questions, right, in this, in what you asked. One is, as pointed out by everyone already, how do you do the crowdsourcing in a way that really takes into account. Sorry, I'm still in Boston time and super jet lagged. So drink more coffee. Yes, I'm trying. Loaded with coffee already. Anyway, so one is how do you do the crowdsourcing that is in a way that gives you the right answer, like the decent answers, accurate answers, so to speak. Like, for example, we already have a lot of problems with democracy around the world, so we know that how that goes. Clearly not so well. The other question is, we know how the informed consents go, like just clicking on some things. You agree on terms and conditions all the time. How often do you read? Never. I never. So we know that as well. And who is the user versus who is going to be affected by the technology? So who has the actual right to say yes or no, I want this, I don't want this. So that's one thing about the practical aspects. The other part about crowdsourcing ethics. And that's where you get the question of what should you be even asking. So I think actually moral machines is a good example of that, in the sense that the question was peculiarly phrased as, what would you do? Instead of what should the car do, whether you are in the driver position, in the crossing person position. There are so many positions that you should be imagining yourself to answer the question, what should the car do? It's not enough to say, what would you do? What would you feel comfortable doing? That's a totally different question. That's a descriptive question. It's not a normative question. And asking the normative question requires more like engaging the people that you're asking the question with, engaging them to ethical reasoning rather than just like survey questions. So that's another trick about ethics crowdsourcing, let's say.
That's a good lead-in, because you talk about surveying, and obviously my last company, in the very end, we were developing a consumer research product that was basically allowing you to scale one-on-one focus groups, but would lead you with a certain type of question. And going through the pattern of like trying to do as much research as we could, it's almost impossible to really develop the right questionnaire that's appropriate to everyone without leading them on, without being only trying to find out one piece that will then skew your data to the way you want it to be, right? Because again, you want to sell your product, so of course you're going to make sure that it's skewing things the way your customer wants it, instead of having a great baseline. So again, like to the point of even having a baseline, all of us are individuals, right? We all have our own personal preferences. Some of us right now are like, when will this guy, some of us just got offended, some of us did not get offended, right? Some of us right now want me to stop talking and like let them talk. Some of us want us to leave and drink more. Some of us want to go home. All of us have different reasons about why we're here right now and why we want this to continue on for another hour, or hopefully you wrap up, in the next 10 minutes because it's getting late. All of us have our own different preferences, right? We can all relate to this even right now. So even with that even said, when we go into these patterns of like trying to develop a baseline, where we're trying to do the most good for the most people, make the most people happy, and everyone lives a beautiful life, and make the world a better place, without sounding cliche. But again, we are all individuals, so the future of AI, I believe, is really in preference, right? Personalization. It'll be a personalization in content, it'll be personalization in everything. We'll all have our own little, hubs. And I was just recently rewatching Black Mirror last night, actually, and I was in season 4. I watched the one about relationships when you go on dates and they rate the city. Actually, you can look up, right, mutually or not, and it hurts you when your expiration date will be. So some dates, right, 3 weeks, and you're like, oh my God, that was the right one, you thought. And then some of them are like 5 years, and you're like, I can't wait for this one to end. And it's like interesting the fact that if given that information, how you skew your perspective on that relationship and everything else. If you knew you only had 24 hours left with that one person, how would you spend that time? If you had 5 years to spend that time with that person, and you already were run the wrong way, how would you also spend that time? And it's a very fascinating thought experiment, and I love doing these things all the time. And people that hang out with me, and they're probably over there by the bar, we do it a lot. Because I usually hang out with way smarter people myself, and I'm grateful for that. And of course, your people, bringing people like yourselves to here, this community is really what keeps me afloat, because we need to have these thought experiments more and more again and again. So for me to stop going down this rabbit hole, really my next question is really around, if we're gonna have, all right, good comment.
I just have 2 quick comments that piggyback off of what you said. So on the data collection piece, you had mentioned that how you word the surveys or how you word the focus groups is so critical in what kind of results you get, and then that affects your product design. And I would also add that how you collect the data for your training data sets also has the same issues, because a lot of times people think, oh, it's a spreadsheet, it's completely neutral, accurate, quantified data, except that spreadsheet came from, let's say, an electronic medical record, or it came from a financial system, and how those questions are worded will affect what data is actually captured, and then whoever is doing the algorithms on it, if they're not aware of the context of how it was captured, may make wrong inferences from it. That's one point. And then the second point about personalization is I'm also a big fan of AI and machine learning personalizing recommendations, but who gets to decide what's a good thing to recommend to me or to personalize for me? So, for example, if I love junk food and I love ice cream and French fries, is it better to personalize recommendations for McDonald's for me, or is it better to like spam me with a lot of health food ads? You know, like who's going to decide? Is it who has the most marketing dollars, who can, you know, buy the most Facebook ads, or is it going to be like some council that says thou must eat healthier food because you're not eating healthy food? Like, who's going to decide that?
I want to chime in because I was at HCAI, one of the big AI conferences in Stockholm, and I saw this interesting talk by Craig Boutillier that now is at Google and is a person working on preferences. So right now what they're looking at Google is how to use preferences to nudge people. So for example, you know when they show when they show you a set of videos, a slate of videos on YouTube, right? They decide which videos to show you, right? And they have an idea and they want you to click on certain videos for certain reason, and they try to drive you to click on them by putting other videos in the slate with them, okay? So this manipulation of preferences can be used for the good of the company, right? But it can be also used for the good of people. So for example, if we saw that, man, she's just eating Twinkies every day, right? We could try to nudge her, right, by showing her some options and showing her a set of options that is constructed in a smart way so that she will be driven, let's say, once a week to eat a salad, right? So you're laughing, but you know, think about that the big corporations are developing tools to, now that we learn your preferences, right, we're going to not only try to get you to buy stuff, right, but also we're going to steer groups of population towards areas, healthier food or more fitness, because in the end, if we steer them there, then we can sell them maybe more products related to that. So,
Just a quick comment on Twinkies. So if I was Amazon, then like Amazon would be giving me the subscribe and save option where it will automatically deliver me a box of 64 Twinkies every month. So I don't even have to think about buying it. I just already auto-subscribe for it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to add something to this as well. So we just finished a white paper with Harvard Law School on this exact question of AI coaching and nudging. The project was brought to us also by Google. We collaborated on this. And like the main thing about the nudges is this, something that we don't often say it and acknowledge it, I think, as often as we should, is that we are not rational. We pretend that we are rational. That's why the informed consent and get the user's agreement. And so we are not rational. That's why we are talking about the nudges. Because you have all these ways of, you are open to manipulation so easily. We have the worry, who is gonna manipulate you? Is it gonna be the companies? Is it gonna be the government? And even in things that seem to be relatively not so controversial. Like, remember some years ago, New York City wanted to ban the huge soda, what is it, the glasses? Yeah, and it didn't work. And they had a good reason. It was because of the obesity epidemic, and it was not stopping you from drinking as much as soda you want, but even that nudge. So if we say that, well, we can use the nudge as well, it goes back to Ben's question, that how are we even gonna, who is gonna do it, and how are we even gonna agree on what is the right way to sway it, if this is gonna be such an influential, manipulative tool?
I'll leave it into my answer to your next question.
So actually, I have two things, and we definitely trust me, I'll wrap it up. So into the piece around the Black Mirror part, I was really trying to get into, so we're all obviously individuals, there's a lot of educated people in the room. For the most part, though, I believe that if we look at media, right, my background's in film, I was in critical studies. I didn't even make films, I studied films. I studied why certain directors were more powerful than other ones, the writer team, understanding the team, the time, everything. Anyways, the point of this saying all that was this. If you look at Idiocracy, if anyone's seen the movie, raise your hands. Has anyone else also seen, shoot, it's not the top of my head. No. Idiocracy is one, and then the other one where, Wall-E, right? Who's seen Wall-E, right? So this kind of depicts a dystopian world where we are all very, very, very lazy people, and we have robots doing everything for us, and Gatorade, flourishes, is the crop fuel that we use, and all these different, crazy things, and we have a crazy leader as a president. It's a ridiculous, dystopia that these films have depicted. And then you look at Her, you look at, Ex Machina, all these different things. Anyways, if we're going to, back to the crowdsourcing piece, where we really want to get the input of our consumers and get the input of, the general populations about what is ethical, what is right and wrong, all these things, how do we develop a baseline for our own individual community, right? So every brand, every corporation should have their own community. And it's going to be very, have its own metrics, its own weights. But how do you trust even other people's opinions if they're not well educated? Yeah, they might buy your brand, right? They might buy that, that Nike sweatshirt, but do you really trust their opinion on, certain issues or about what's right or wrong for you as a corporation to even deal with? So my biggest issue is, how are we going to, as a society, really going to start helping everyone, right? From the low income to the 1%ers to everyone else, to really understand, have a better education and really understand what is right from wrong, what is good, what is the best for everyone, and not just only for the self-centered. But how do we go about even developing a baseline or even helping the majority of the world? I know there's a huge question, but it would be amazing. What's the stepping stones? What's the first steps? Would be my question to you is, what are the first steps to developing this baseline and helping the most people in the world become educated?
So Michael did not answer the last question, so go ahead.
It wasn't really a question, the last question. That was just everyone interrupting, making very, very valuable contributions, but poor choice of words. Well, actually, they're kind of linked. What I was going to say, I think, to some extent, answer your question, which is that how many of these tools really exist fully for us at the moment, right? We participate in them to varying degrees of, with varying degrees of agency and varying degrees of consciousness and varying degrees of consent. But all of these tools generally exist for a separate set of purposes, which are profits for the corporations that develop them in the most part. So there are inbuilt biases in the system that are designed to exploit certain of our preferences, certain of our behavioural leanings, and so on. So I think the answer to your question is we need to start moving into a sort of the next phase of big data tools, the next phase of the web, the next phase of AI, where I personally would like to see more democratisation and more availability of some of these tools for people to use, for the commons to use. I think we need to find ways to make certain data sets available publicly. We need to find ways to demystify some of the tools that can be used to interrogate those data sets and build applications on top of those that can then be used to sort of stimulate the next phase of innovation in this sector and rebalance, if you like, the power disparity that exists at the moment, whereby those tools are controlled by large companies and obviously they're controlled by governments. To some extent they exist in labs from some of these people here, but most of us can't go out and use them and explore the world with them and decide that we're going to start an NGO off the back of it, or a new political party, or a new company. So that's what I would like to see, and I think that's the next step that we need to take personally.
No, I wanted to say something that I think what you said about educating the public is very, very important. Because we hear a lot of push for explainability, right? But it has to be kind of a bi-directional movement where we generate explanations from AIs, right, that are more and more understandable, more and more simple, but then we also have to bring up and educate more people so that they can understand these explanations, because at some point there will be a level where we can break it down even more, right? So one could kind of do a recursive approach and say, well, automated tutors, right, or artificial agent tutoring systems can come to the rescue. They have a very low cost and they can teach, 60,000 people simultaneously instead of a poor human professor growling at 20 students, right? Yeah, from personal experience, right? So that could be an option, but you're right, and I think that one of the interventions that needs to be made from a top-down point of view is a push to educate people from the most elementary levels of education, the younger children, to understand AI, right, and to produce content on AI that can be easily understood for all people that use AI in different ways. Anybody?
Sure. So I would say that, first of all, of course, like we should definitely try to bring our education level around the world as high as possible. So no question about that. But I think it's very important to acknowledge that there's individual preferences and individual responsibility in making decisions about your own life, learning things that should matter to your decisions, seeking out the information. But then also I do think there's also value in division of labor. It shouldn't be my responsibility to figure out everything about the financial planning so that my retirement plan does not leave me broke. It should be the case that the financial system, for example, organizes itself in such a way that my options are pretty good, and then I just put in my preferences and get the decent result. Same goes for healthcare, and same goes for a lot of AI systems. I think the division of labor here is that we cannot expect the whole society, everybody around the world, to push for ethical AI. The thing is, well, those who are actually developing, those who are actually controlling, they have the responsibility. They have to own up to the responsibility. So there has to be some understanding that we have to do, as those people who are working in the AI scene, we have to do as much as we can to make sure that the AI systems are trying to provide good options. And then, well, maybe you still want to eat your junk food and you are going to personalize your AI in that way. But at least I make sure that I don't make you an obese person because I made a deal with McDonald's. So it has to be the case that there's division of labor. We acknowledge our particular roles in developing AI systems. And then there is the part that, yes, everybody needs to educate themselves just to live well, by the way, not just about AI, just to make your decisions in the democratic system, in the political system, just to have good decisions in your relationships. So that's one thing, and the other one is the responsibility. When did you want to? Okay.
I wanted to open up Q&A. So, who's got your burning questions, burning design questions?
When 20 years ago Microsoft created that assistant in Windows, it was just an assistant. 20 years down the road, yeah, perfectly. 20 years down the road, and a lot of systems that much worse than that, calling themselves AI, and there's a lot of hype about AI. And we're all talking here about those automation systems and talking about the creators, how for them to be moral or ethical. I mean, the people who are least expected to do anything immoral. Shouldn't we talk about a real AI that is approaching to become somewhat conscious, that are being created in places where there's a lot of money and a lot of power? And shouldn't we talk about how we people create some rules or some controls of balance. So our crazier parts of population do not use it for immoral things.
So I think you bring up a good question, and what I was thinking is that AI, like any other technology, can be used by anyone as a tool. Just like bricks, just like iron, just like electricity, it can be used as a tool by anyone. And I personally don't necessarily have the power to stop a criminal or dictator from using any particular tool or technology for evil purposes. That being said, I think all of us on this panel and the people in this room, within our own circles, we can try to advocate for the people, our immediate circles and our wider circles, to try to encourage people to be more mindful about using AI for good. Now, one thing I think is interesting is, can we develop an AI for good that can fight the AI for bad? Because, at some point, the quote, evil AI is going to get so smart and so manipulative that I'm not even going to notice it. Like, it's going to game me, and I didn't even realize that I was duped. So I think at some point you do, it's similar like in cybersecurity, there's like bad hackers and the good hackers that are trying to fight the bad hackers. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, yes, the panel today, I think we focus a lot about, human developers and human programmers and human data scientists, but I see that the trend, especially within the next 5-10 years, a lot of the AI and machine learning programming and coding and mathematics is actually going to be automated by an actual AI program itself. So it's going to be AI programming AI programs. And then that gets into even more complicated ethical issues of who created the initial AI program that's going to make all the subsequent programs in some sort of semi or completely automatic fashion. And as machine learning becomes more unsupervised and more iterative, even if you initially program it for some good purpose or some good constraint, it can continually morph and morph pretty quickly. And I'm not really sure how to control that because the machines are going to be faster than humans.
Can I just say just a little addition? I was thinking while Gwen was answering, I was thinking a good example of how to, like what kind of an analogy I can give. And this is not great because I just came up with it, but it just to give you an idea. It's like, I find this question of like super intelligence being the most important thing, and let's forget about the narrow intelligence related questions, a little bit like, yes, we were trying to control flu 500 years ago, and we had ways of trying to do it, so it's not a new thing that we are still trying to develop flu vaccine, but it's still very important, and we should discuss this. We should discuss that the flu vaccine is not as good as it's supposed to be. This doesn't mean that we should just worry about that one flu that's going to be like a Spanish flu that's going to like get rid of half the population. That's not how we should just focus on. We should be thinking about what's at hand, the next flu season that's coming up, as well as the possible big outbreak that we have to worry about. So similar with the AI, I would say these questions that we discuss in the narrow intelligence is, I think, extremely important because that's affecting all of our lives every day, and it will as we go forward. And when, if ever, the superintelligence develops, then we should prepare for it. But those are not mutually exclusive.
Yes. So do you feel like humans are a good example for ethics and morals? Or do you want more of a framework where a machine system, right, that can observe humans and look at what's patterns related to that? Because if I say, who is your model, right? Who is your model for an ethical machine or a moral machine? I don't think we have a model, right? Because there's always that flaw so I think it's the goal to create a flawless, moral, ethical machine. Is that even possible? It's like telling me all data is non-biased. It's hard to achieve. So I think what is the right model to copy? Because that's what AI is trying to copy. Or is that even, if that premise, is that correct or not correct?
This is where the baseline of what is actually legal
use that as a framework to build
versus
what's legal here in the U.S. it may be illegal here. So yeah,
Different law, but yeah, it could be local. You know, it could be U.S. AI, it could be Russia AI, whatever it is. But that's the baseline for a framework to build on.
So since humans started living together in societies, we have been devising moral and ethical and legal and political frameworks to regulate the way in which we interact with one another. And as we talked about earlier, they're very subjective, they're very culturally dependent, they vary and change over time, and so on. So I don't, you know, maybe it's the case that machine learning and higher forms of reasoning might help us to sort of achieve some, you know, perfect form or close to perfect form of morality. Maybe it will, I don't know. Until it does, I mean, we should explore that, and wonderful researchers like these should do some work on it. But otherwise, I think, you know, yes, it should learn from and reflect us, including our flaws and the mistakes we make, and learn from how we've learned from our mistakes. Where there's a really interesting set of questions is around morality, not to do with how humans interact with each other, but how they interact with, you know, for example, our ecosystem, and sort of, you know, giving us some alternative points of view on the logic and the ways in which we make decisions about things that have consequences for species other than our own, for example. That would be a truly, maybe that's a good place to start.
Can I actually just follow up on this? Sorry, Ben. I think that's exactly the reason why learning from humans are scary. Because learning from humans also entails the fact that we have been treating anything that does not have negotiative power terribly. So if the AI at some point gets to the level of not even consciousness I'm talking about, just the negotiation power that it doesn't have to have this game theory with us, then I think, well, it might just end up treating us terribly if it learns from us. And I agree with you in the sense that trying to have the perfect morality might not even be possible. On the other hand, I don't know, I want to talk to Brent about it, because of this, like, how would you put the moral theories rather than human behavior? But yeah, like humans are clearly wildly immoral, so I don't know what would we end up with if we try to learn from their behavior. But a different thing could be all moral theories start by observing human behavior and trying to figure out what is the essence of the good behavior. So if we use that sort of the goal of the machine in some ways, maybe that's a different way of going.
Yeah, I just want to add a short thing that there is value in modeling in a computational way human morality or ethics in any case, because we have to embed in the AIs a model of humans, because they will have to interact with humans. So when they see humans doing crazy things, they have to be able to say, oh, I see, okay, you're kind of, you know, you're having a bad day, a bad moral day, you're human, you're having a bad moral day, I'm not going to shoot you, right? And I'm not going to terminate you because you acted against my, you know, what is moral. I might call that, turn you in, I don't know. But, so I think there is, I'm trying to make it funny because it's a little late, but there is a value. We still have to build a model of human behavior to put in the AI so that they can interact and understand what humans do. But it may not be the same that we want the AIs to do. And that's the crucial, I agree, nobody knows because we are designing the AIs, right?
So I think I wouldn't necessarily model it just based on existing laws, which are really for political, regulatory reasons and things like that, because there's a lot of things that might be commonly upheld social values that are not in the law. So things like don't lie. I think most people would say that that's pretty good. And I would agree also with Michael that in many cultures they will say don't lie as long as you don't hurt people with a lie or some sort of other caveat. And then the other thing is, like, the example that came to mind when you mentioned about, you know, framing it based on current laws is, I don't think there's a current law that says robots shouldn't kill cats or that robots shouldn't cook the cats for their owner. And so it's...
Animal cruelty. I mean, most of the stuff you're talking about has existing in the framework.
So I think there are lots of scenarios that don't have a legal framework, and there's also a lot of day-to-day interactions. Like, for
My point was that, like, I'm not saying that it's mutually exclusive to use your term, but you have to start with what's legal in whichever culture you're in, because if you break the law, you're going to be held either legally responsible and go to jail, or civilly responsible, and your company's going to go under because it's been sued. That's what I'm saying. Then, in terms of all the gradation that you're talking about is it legal to, cook the cat or whatever, if there's not an applicable law, yeah, then that's when you start building the moral framework on top of the legal foundation. How about that?
This point about legality now is about if you're being policed enough about it. So think about using GDPR, or like how you can even collect information. Like Facebook of the world, right? Only because they got caught, they are now being policed. So again, right, as much as like these companies, they might be doing things that are wrong, it's about who the hell is policing us, or Americans at least now, or even who's the accountability of the European Union now that they have GDPR in place, is know if they're doing it right or wrong with their information gathering. Who's checking their code? Who's checking how much data they have? All these things. There's no one policing any of this data. It's the Wild West, no matter fucking what. And excuse my language, right? So I feel like as much as there is a baseline, it's about also, cool, there's a baseline about what's right and wrong, but if you're not being policed, and there's no, like, anyone being held accountable, then everyone, because of my original question we were getting about, what's the economic incentive for these companies to do the right thing? Well, if you're not being policed, and you can make more money doing something that might be a little shady, collecting a little bit more data than you really should about people's preferences and their economic status and how they, the social graph about how the relationship it correlates to other people. What's the legalities in that? And I don't know, just policing it.
So one more thing. You said the starting point is don't do something illegal, right? What if the thing that is illegal is the right thing to do? So, and I'm not making this as a random guess. I'm talking about, for example, there are laws that, depending on which country you are, your tweets, your social media sharings might have to be reported. So now the company, should it start by, let's go with the law first? No. The question is, are you gonna challenge the law there? And that's what happens. Turkey has a lot of those cases where you challenge the law. So you don't start with, let's go with the law, and then look at the ethics. You have to actually ask the question whether the law is right.
I was going to say the same thing.
Like
we do some work internationally, and like for example, China's government is doing a mass surveillance of their population with image recognition, facial recognition, and then also a lot of Middle Eastern countries are doing that as well. And any suspicious activity can land you in jail, regardless of whether you actually did something wrong. And so the law is that the government can do surveillance on you without your permission,